Joining us now are Tucker Marion and Sebastian Fixson, and we're going to have a conversation that should feel quite well connected to the one we just concluded. We're going to talk about the skills that the innovation workforce will need. So Sebastian, I see you have joined us on camera, and we can give Tucker just a second to join us as well.
Well, good morning, Paul. Thanks for having us. It's my pleasure to be here.
And
thank
Paul,
you.
My microphone is on. For some reason, my camera says it's on. Hopefully that will come back in a second.
And Tucker, we can hear you well. So that's great. So let me do some quick introductions. Tucker J. Marion is an associate professor of technological entrepreneurship at Northeastern University's Damore McKim School of Business, and Sebastian K. Fixson is associate dean of innovation and the Marla M. Capozzi MBA 96 term chair of design, thinking, innovation, and entrepreneurship at Babson College. And Sebastian, that is quite a title. So in your recent work, you've identified 4 skills that the innovation workforce will need to compete and succeed in the 4th industrial revolution. And we'll get into a specific conversation of each of those skills in just a bit, but let's do a little stage setting first. And Tucker, maybe I can begin with you. Can you give the audience just a quick definition of what we mean by the 4th industrial revolution and how it will change the nature of work?
Sure. Well, if we look at over the last 15 years, the changes in digital communication technology, changes in culture with collaboration, that we're able to access and use that change in technology, combined with changes in how we can design and make things. So the propagation of all sorts of design tools that enable changes in the way teams can design physical products and also software, and also how those things can be constructed. And this has really come to the point where companies that are leveraging these sorts of things can proceed the tasks and the organization that runs those activities can have profound changes on it. And I think that as we've seen with changes of the other types of changes during the Industrial Revolution, starting in the 1800s to today, we're in a period of massive dynamic change. And of course, now we're thrown into another massive change over the last month or two. And it's really what we like. Sebastian and I have kind of coined the term for this particular instance is somewhat of a perfect storm of these changes in tools, the way we can work, and how that might mean for changes and how we actually do the activities of developing new innovation.
Well, that's great, and I want to come back to the kind of particular environment that we are all struggling with right now in just a second. But let's set that aside for a moment. In comparison with other kind of major waves, or the preceding 3 waves of the Industrial Revolution, help us understand the gap between where we are now relative to where we need to be this time versus the last 3.
Sebastian, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I think maybe as a little piece of background, even though Tucker and I work both on business schools, we are by training originally engineers. So lots of our studies in the innovation activities and processes looked at people who do technical work. And in particular, over the last 15 years, we looked into the effect of digital tools. And the one thing, Paul, to answer your question, we noticed is that in the past, often tools simply increased the productivity, right? Allow people to do more and better outputs. And I think what we notice now is that the digital tools allow people to do very different things. It allows people to design and invent very different solutions. It also allows more people to enter the innovation activities, so changes the competitive landscape. So we feel, and what we found in our studies is that not only the process itself gets accelerated, but it has impacted the innovation work, which then led us to distilling these 4 skills that were in the article as sort of the key points that we think the skills need to be acquired by us initially studying technical people, but I think it's more broadly true for everyone.
Well, so let's move into the 4 skills. Let's get into the gritty, and we'll kind of dive in and out during this conversation. I will tee them up, and whoever between the two of you wants to take each one, please feel free. The first is my favorite, and this would have my daughter rolling her eyes. Omniscience.
Sure. Well, based on the research that we've done, and what you can, well, number one, we've seen so many changes in how we can actually approach the activities of work, right? So we know that. And this is changing so rapidly that a tool you might have used 5 years ago is irrelevant today, and we might have something pop up tomorrow. Given that, and combined with the complexity of the businesses that are leveraging these tools, that it requires really a very high level of systems thinking and how you approach the design, development, and commercialization of things. So I'll give an example. In the article, we discuss a medical device company. And traditionally, in traditional R&D, yes, you might have a patient need, and you develop a particular device that solves that. One of the chief innovation officers of the company that we're speaking with says, no, actually, what we need to do is take a much higher level view of starting with patient outcomes and working all the way back. And that means we need to understand everything from treatment through the actual procedure itself, to the device, to all the way to the beginning of that particular technology development deep inside an R&D organization. And how do you knit together all those individuals, all those different ways that you're touching those actors within that process? And it really requires kind of a very holistic sense of not only the tools that you're using, but how you interface with all of the actors along and stakeholders along that value chain, and how that ultimately impacts the performance of whatever system you're developing. So it requires, a very broad set of skills, the ability to learn new things very quickly. And it's one of those things that we're seeing a need for education and the skill development, what Michael talked about earlier, is that in our traditional method of teaching business and engineering, we're still very siloed, and we need to go up many, many levels to develop those sorts of skills.
And so in your description of omniscience, we're not really talking about an individual skill as much as that would be something, but a collective skill, correct?
Yes, well, a collective suite of skills. So it may be technical, it may be business related, ethical, as we mentioned as one of the points in the article, and really to be able to knit together these different types of characteristics that you have to bring to the table in order to deal with the complexity of the products and services that are needed today.
Thank you. The second skill on your list is certainly a more familiar one, and that's an entrepreneurial mindset.
Yeah, let me take this one. In our research, again, what we initially studied were people being in the act of innovations, right? So what we noticed is that with the increasing volatility of the environment and the teams trying to chart unknown waters, that it became clear to us that what they needed to do is to develop often their own solutions. And that led obviously in established organizations to all kinds of conflicts. Can we use a new software that hasn't been approved by our IT group? Can we pull in outsiders whose expertise we need? All these kinds of questions. And I think what we realized is to be successful in this environment, employees need to be acting a lot more with an entrepreneurial mindset, focusing, as Michael also mentioned earlier, as well as Scott in the first talk that you had, that the focus is on learning. But the learning needs to be sort of structured and organized by the teams themselves, because if it's unknown to the large organization what the path is, the team has to find its path forward. So it needs to develop the skill set and the mindset, which is sort of an attitude question, to try to figure things out for themselves in a much, much quicker way than many processes and established organizations typically allow.
And to follow on, as to give an example of that, we spend some time with a local Boston company that you wouldn't think would be as high tech as it is, and they have really reshaped and reformed their R&D organization to focus on a digital group. And this digital group actually went out and developed their own artificial intelligence software package for generative design to help the teams do that. And they did it internally. They didn't purchase a piece of software. They actually developed the code themselves. And that is really a unique piece of intellectual property that they've developed. And they're seeing that as the core of their business going forward is to maximize the capability of that internal digital group.
And maybe more broadly, even though the article focuses on skills of the employees, there's obviously the flip side, what the role of the company is in this situation, right? And in the book that Tucker and I published last year, in which we lay out the innovation landscape into 4 modes, as we call them, one of them is labeled venture mode. And that is exactly asking the companies to create an environment in which employees then can articulate and express their entrepreneurial mindset and activities.
Thank you. Once we're done talking about the other 2 skills, I want to actually pursue that thread a little bit further. But let's stay on our role and move to the 3rd skill you identify, which is ever more familiar and not exactly new, and that's a bottom line focus.
Sure, I'll take this. So I think that one of the things, and of course the world that we're dealing with now, is that's more important than ever, as you have Ford projected to lose $2 billion in this quarter alone, and to think about how that's going to change businesses such as that. What we want to do in the article is to push to really think about how using the different ways that we can communicate, collaborate, develop things, how that can actually push you to really improve a focus on the bottom line. And that could be new products, it could be new services. In the article, we talk about an example of developing a digital twin. And one of the companies that we worked with very closely with this was an individual within an organization that was charged with really maximizing the use and showing the benefit of using digital twins, ultimately leading to a wide array of brand new services and features within the product that could be monetized in a different way. And because this individual was an omniscient thinker, so to speak, and really thinking about the entire system and how to leverage this new technology, that it ultimately led to the potential of brand new sources of revenue for not only the company itself producing the software, but also the companies using this to design their products and services. And it was very apparent that those individuals and organizations that can leverage this really open up lots of opportunities for really reshaping their business. One of the example companies that we use is a Canadian company called Dental Wings, which has really rethought the end-to-end business of dental implants, and it's a really unique case.
I think, Paul, you mentioned it shouldn't be surprising that the bottom line focus is an important skill. I mean, one way to think about this is that, of course, business leaders and executives always have this in mind. But I think what we're arguing for is that that's another argument against the siloing of the structures, that more people understand what their part is into the larger business models, and especially with the changes from business models from product to services. A lot of the technical skills that used to be focused on improving a particular technical performance need to understand the relationship of what they do to the ultimate customer outcome, and therefore to the success of the business model. So in some sense, the argument is that the employees on a broader level need to understand much more about how the business works and why it works as a business, how they can contribute to new business models.
Thank you. And the fourth skill you identify, maybe not quite as familiar, certainly not as a phrase, and that's ethical intelligence. Sebastian, do you want to begin with this one?
Sure. I mean, neither Tucker nor I are experts in the subject of ethics. However, just as the digitalization drove a number of forces that we identified, creating the requirements for the skills 1 through 3, I think the examples all around us with data breaches, misinformation, etc., the challenges with AI and its interpretability of the results. All of that suggests to us that yes, we want to use the digital tools, we as a society, as employees, as organizations, but with it comes an enormous amount of responsibility. So we think in the organizations, we need to have mechanisms to raise certain questions, to force certain discussions into the open, to enable people to ask certain questions. I think one of the earlier speakers talked about psychological safety in terms of productivity and innovation and allowing creative ideas to emerge. I think the same is true for critical questions, to avoid certain disasters that, at least in an exemplary level, we already have witnessed is that this technology does come with some challenges. And so both on the individual level as well as an organizational level, we feel processes that reminds us to ask certain questions, give us the permission to ask the questions, are really critical.
Thank you. So if you were writing the article today, would the skills be the same? And meaning, I'm speaking in particular about kind of life in the pandemic and what we can expect in the social and economic aftermath for some time to come. Would the list stay the same? And if so, do any of these skills carry more or less weight given this dramatically changed environment?
Well, that's a great question. I think that how we approached the article was really to think forward in time and what will be increasingly important in the future. And I think that the future in some ways is accelerated very quickly. So I don't think that we would necessarily change some of the skills that we talked about, but as you had mentioned, there are some that we might amplify. And I think that, let's say, one of them might be the entrepreneurial skill portion of that, because we, even in our daily activities, are trying to figure out the best way to use Slack, or how do we even show ourselves on Teams or Zoom? Do we have a background? Do we not? How do we deal with individuals and students that may not have access? So we're, even in these very small activities, we're trying to figure out new ways to do things. And I think that is a skill that we might emphasize a little more if we were to write that article today.
Very good.
Yeah, as the earlier conversations this morning suggested, what COVID-19 primarily has done is accelerating the uncertainty and volatility of our environment, right? So all the skills that are helpful in navigating in a more uncertain, more volatile environment are certainly helpful. And I think the entrepreneurial mindset for all of us is absolutely necessary, right? As Tucker said, we as instructors, as professors, have to find new ways to work with them. It's true for all other functions in our schools. I mean, Michael drew a very interesting picture of what may happen to a number of schools going forward. And I think it behooves us to be as entrepreneurial as everybody else needs to be.
So we're getting lots of great questions from our audience, and I'm going to begin incorporating some of those. Sure. Is the development of these skills a workforce problem or a company problem? I think that it's a question about responsibility. And are companies even able to articulate what they expect to need from their workforces right now?
Well, I think to add some comments to that question, it's a great question, by the way. I think that we need to look at this as multiple levels. I think that, number one, there's an individual level, that if you empower yourself to try to think about improving your own skills, that's the kind of the first level. The second would be organizational. So there's impact on how do we train employees? What's the most effective way to do that? And also, how does this impact the actual organization design? Do we add the ability to have self-selected entrepreneurial teams? Do we change the scope and of the different department structure and business units? And then I think the third level would be overall, how do we think about changing the workforce itself through higher education, through incentives? Maybe potentially, does the government play a role, or state governments play a role in helping to try to drive these skills? So I think that there are multiple levels and lenses that you can look at this.
Yeah, great. Thank you. is the level of urgency we should feel? And I think that the underlying question here is the need for the skills you've identified universal across industry? Is everyone on the same timeline, or depending on your function or industry or role, should we feel more or less urgency?
That's a very interesting question. I think my quick answer would be, no matter the industry you're in, right? And so the general need to build these skills and more of these, I think, is true across the board. It's probably true that some industries have different clock speeds, to use Charlie Fine's term, and those who are slower due to government regulations or some other forces that slower their cycle might have a bit more time than those that change much faster. But in the spirit of the theme of disruption today, I think there isn't any industry who should be complacent of thinking, well, it won't happen to us.
Very good. Let's see what's next. If I'm in, I think there's a lot of interest in, what do we do with these insights, right? So you've identified, I think, quite clearly these skills and their value. But if I'm an organizational development or organizational learning leader, and I'm certain there are quite a few people who fit that description in our audience, how do I move forward? How do I take these skills and take that first step, right? And I think maybe we only talk about the first step today, towards a broad kind of learning plan or skill development plan for my organization.
Want to take that one, Sebastian?
Yeah, sure. So I think there are two major avenues to think about. Well, one is if it's a skill set that you think needs outside training or some form of expertise, whether it's professional learning companies or higher education institutions like ours, there are ways to find support. But I think the other one is, and we are increasingly thinking about this ourselves, is this notion of learning by doing, right? And so, or what organizations can do themselves, and again, we talk about this in our book, is if you create an environment that enables people to develop these skills while doing their work, or some of these skills at least, you basically kill two birds with one stone. And also the learning might the learning might be more integrated in people's work life, and therefore is easier to retrieve and has more impact on the life. So in other words, I think the learning and development officer needs to be more integrated or more connected to the work that happens in the organization, instead of being only a separate entity that offers some training in certain intervals or cadences.
Oftentimes, when organizations are kind of undertaking broad cultural transformation, and I think development of these skills is likely to qualify along those lines, they're able to identify kind of people who are exemplary of where the organization needs to go in the future. Any thoughts on how organizations can identify the members of their workforce who might be further along in development of some of the required skills?
Sure, I think that from, organizations are, if you have an executive team that is interested in changing and transformation, that's one thing. And we've seen, from the innovation management literature perspective over many decades, it's almost, that's the easy part, is that you have an executive team trying to push the organization in a certain way, and that can be effective. That's certainly valuable. But in the case of some very famous companies that have gone away, is that you may have multiple changes of executive teams doing that, but you have this amorphous middle, so to speak, that some research has talked about, and trying to change the culture can be very, very difficult. So if you're going to identify individuals that would be innovation champions, so to speak, I think that number one, you look at their willingness to be leaders within that particular middle of the organization. how empowered they are, how willingness they are to learn new skills, how willing they are to take risk and to fail. And those, and there may not be a lot of them, but there certainly will be a subset of those individuals. And those individuals should be tasked with trying to think about ways that we can implement new skills within the organization and propagate that from the bottom or the middle out through the organization. I think that's really the most effective way of trying to change culture. And there are a number of different examples from firms that have done that successfully.
Well, what I would add is that in addition to identifying the exemplars, as you call them, I think one of the big consequences is when you ask your employee base to behave more entrepreneurial, you have to let them do that. And so that means for the leadership that the entire power structure will change. And this is easy, much easier said than done. If you want not only these few examples, but broader sections of your employees to behave more entrepreneurially, you will have to give them more to decide. So that probably requires a whole new organizational structure as well as power structure.
And including incentives. And one is this can take a long time. Even though we have to change the mindset where we may not change within 6 months. We want to keep at it for a period of time. We see that change in the organization. Excuse me.
Thank you. A question for either of you, although Sebastian, it's directed towards you. Is Peter Senge's model of the learning organization still valid?
Well, I think, as many speakers this morning suggested, that the act of learning itself is indeed one of the critical elements to survive in any uncertain environment. I mean, Peter's model is what, now about 30 years old, and I think it's very insightful. It was formulated before the digital age, if you will, so I could see elements of being updated, but the general insight as an organization needs to learn to survive, I think still holds true, yes.
Great, and a final question that either of you can feel free to answer. Connecting this conversation, this excellent conversation, with the one that preceded it, what is the role of organized education to address these skill gaps? What kind of collaboration is required between corporate and academia?
Well, I'll just give a quick couple sentences and then Sebastian hop in. I think that we need to see much closer integration between the needs of corporations and what we are developing as the workers of the future. That is, for me, that's absolutely paramount. I don't think that we do a good enough job today. And actually related to this, there's a huge educational aspect to these 4 skills that we don't really touch upon in the article that needs to be addressed. And I think that, and relating to the last discussion, I think we all will be experimenting with different ways to develop these sorts of skills for organizations. But key to that is really understanding what the organizations need going forward. And Sebastian, I don't want to add to that.
Well, Paul, I think that's a discussion for another half an hour at least. But let me give you a 30-second answer. I think what we identified as the skills here initially focused on employees, but collectively for organizations. The same is true for application. I think we need to be much more integrated, as Tucker said, with our customer and our customers. I think the field of higher education will become far more diverse, homogenic as it is now, homogeneous, and it will change. So the speed will accelerate and change. And so that means we need to change faster. And we will.
Sebastian, Tucker, thank you very much for a terrific conversation.